Hello, I'm Jonathan Massey. As I think most of you know, I've had a chance to work with many of you over the years. I'm a professor of architecture here and dean of the Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning here at the University of Michigan. And it's my pleasure and privilege to kick things off here at the fifth of five amazing symposia that the Egalitarian Metropolis team has organized over the past few weeks to culminate a really decade-long set of conversations, research projects, teaching initiatives, collaborations, and conversations across many disciplines here at the University of Michigan and with partners in Detroit, and for a period of the project also in Mexico City and elsewhere. Conversations that have really focused on the questions of equity and justice in urban planning, urban development, and in how we think about the past, present, and future of a city like Detroit that has epitomized extremes of prosperity and disinvestment, has been shaped by racial capitalism, but also African-American initiative and many other dynamics. And to help us think also about what is the role of the university vis-a-vis cities and communities here and elsewhere. And among these, in the course of these concluding symposia, we've opened this project up from a number of angles. And the theme in this closing session is to reflect on the project, to look back on the Detroit School of Urbanism with some of its founders, and also some of the people who enlisted in this line of study, thinking, and research, and who are carrying this work forward in their scholarship and in their teaching, and are going to help answer the question, where do we go from here? So this is both a valedictory, concluding look back, but also a reflection geared toward the future. And I look forward both to understanding the project in new ways and also to understanding where some of our next generation scholars and leaders are taking us. So we're some of our progenitors, some of our key speakers here today are progenitors of the project, and that includes Angela Dillard, the chair of our history department, and three recently emeritus faculty from Tubman College, Robert Fishman, Margaret Dewar, and June Manning Thomas, who are back with us today. Very grateful that you stayed engaged. And I know some of you are still doing this work from the position of emeritus, which allows 100% dedication to the project you want to work on, instead of chairing dean search committees and ridiculous things like that. I'll just say a couple more things about the project. I think most of you know it pretty well, but I want to honor the fact that it was built around the premise of collaboration across disciplines and across schools and colleges here at the university. It was compelling enough to earn support from the Mellon Foundation, more than $1 million of grant funding over 2 cycles of the grant. As it developed, it learned from what took root and grew and what didn't. It started out with a multi-city international comparative framework and ended up centering Detroit because that was really where the energies came to life, and it's what people responded to most. And it folded in some of what we were learning here at University of Michigan from things like an interdisciplinary cluster hire of faculty centering Detroit in their research. It folded in insights from ARC Prep, Michigan Architecture Prep, our high school program with Detroit Public Schools. Some of you were there at our ARC Prep space yesterday, reflecting on some of what we've learned in that program. Today we have the opportunity to welcome back these key faculty and to celebrate some of our distinguished alumni who are making their paths in academia and in teaching and in other ways. It's going to be good. I understand there's even a reception afterward. So now I'm going to hand things off to one of our most accomplished alumni and someone who has been coming back through Tubman College intermittently during the 5.5 years that I've been here, and always sharing brilliant ideas. That is Sonia Hirt. Sonia is Dean and Professor in Landscape Architecture and Planning at the University of Georgia College of Environment and Design. She trained initially as an architect in her hometown of Sofia in Bulgaria, but she earned master's and doctoral degrees in urban and environmental planning here at the University of Michigan. Her previous roles have been at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. She was at Virginia Tech, where she was Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the College of Architecture and Urban Studies, and then at the University of Maryland in College Park, where she was Dean prior to going to Georgia. I first met Sonia, I think in maybe my very first year here. I believe it was one of the first gathering of a group of colleagues that became the Equity in Architectural Education Consortium. And it was thrilling to learn about Sonia's connection to Tubman College, and we have benefited from collaboration before that, and especially since that day. Sonia is the author, co-author, or editor of nearly 90 scholarly and professional publications with something approaching 3,000 citations. Give it out for rockstar Sonia.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the wonderful introduction that quite exaggerated my bio. But anyway, and thank you so much for having me here. I was, it was completely out of the blue. Can everyone hear me? Good. So it was completely out of the blue, and I got an email from the Tubman, from Dan Comer. Where did he go? Here he is. Thank you for sending me that initial email. Whether I'd like to be part of this symposium. And I'm like, okay, but this is a 2-week symposium. I can't be there for 2 weeks. And how am I supposed to do closing remarks of a thing that I haven't been part of? So I'm gonna use my privilege as an old person here. So I'm gonna talk about what I want to talk about, rather than necessarily about the content. So I graduated with my PhD in 2003. So this actually is the 20th anniversary since I graduated. And I think this is the best opportunity that I've had over the last 20 years to say thank you. So that's all I'm going to talk about. My life will always be shaped professionally and personally from what I've learned here at the University of Michigan. Pretty much everything I've learned either from the University of Michigan or from TV. Those are my two major sources. And I was thinking, what am I going to say in this space here, aside from the bland thank you, which I specifically want to acknowledge who I'm thanking here. It's the emerita faculty that Jonathan mentioned, Margie and June and Robert, and also Scott, who I hear will never retire. And so I was thinking what I really learned. And so let me give you my favorite teaching story. There is a connection. If you wait for my story, there is a connection with the Tubman. So what is my favorite teaching story? Well, I teach a course, done this for many years, which happens to be called Cities of Europe. And so, how these general survey classes open, the first 2 sessions, even if you try not to, people are going to debate what is city. And then for the next 2 sessions, people debate what's Europe. All debatable topics. And so I felt, there was debate. And like at the end of class one time, I felt there is no closure whatsoever. I had to say something really profound, but there is no conclusion. So it came to me that the best way to end this class is to remember the ancient, I've heard Indian, but some people say it's Chinese wisdom. So what is the answer to the question, what does the earth sit on? I mean, where is the earth located? Now, everyone knows, of course, that the earth sits on a giant turtle. In some versions, it's a giant elephant, and I understand there is a claim that's actually a wolverine. Whatever it is. So the earth sits on the turtle, and then after that, there are 2 turtles and 4, and I thought that the University of Maryland there, I had to use the turtle. Because that's the mascot. So anyway, so there's an endless, so how does this story end? That there is no end to the story. There is always a next layer. And I think this is actually a very good metaphor for what I learned at the University of Michigan, what I try to instill in my students, and what generally academia is all about. There is no answer to your question. There are many layers of explanation. And each explanation, at least in the social sciences and humanities, leads to something else. And I think what this little metaphor teaches us is that we need to be very curious, because there are always more turtles to find. And also that we have to be very humble about our attempts to learn about the world and explain it, because ultimately, whatever turtle you think you have discovered, it's only one of many. And there's so many alternative explanations. So this sort of humility and curiosity around the world is something that I very much learned here in the hallways of the University of Michigan. And this combination of curiosity and humility, for me, is what I have tried to convey to my students. Another little metaphor to go into ancient Eastern proverbs that, in my mind, explains what I learned at the University of Michigan. I think this is from Lao Tzu. So it may be an incredible, I'm paraphrasing, it is an incredible artistic project to create a pot of clay. But it's the space inside the pot that matters. And I think this is exactly what the University of Michigan has done for me, and also for, I think, generations of other students. It provided the structure. It was that beautiful pot of clay that provided the structure, but it allowed you to build your own space inside. So it was, for me, the perfect combination between, here is how you can think about research, but you also have to find it for yourself. So I really appreciated both the structure and the freedom that I learned here from the faculty at the Tubman College. So specifically speaking about these 3 amazing professors, somehow, by chance, I managed not to get into the classroom with any of the 3 of them. June came about 2000, which means I was pretty much done with my coursework. Margie was here before. Somehow I never took, this is very embarrassing, a class in economic development. I don't know why this class was not required, but anyway, I didn't somehow do it right. And Robert was brand new. And actually my first memory, I still have this memory of Robert when I was going to meet him the first time. And I think Scott recommended that I meet him. And he just had gotten here. And Scott said, he's the perfect person. You have to ask him to be on your dissertation committee. Well, how am I going to ask a name that big? I was like, oh my God. So I remember the office was on the 2nd floor. This is before the new wing was open. And I specifically went there 15 minutes ahead. So I could pace like a lion in a cage in front of his office for 15 minutes and rehearse my speech and ponder on the consequences of what will I do if he says no. Well, I was very, very lucky, and he said yes. Everything else is history. And I don't think that I literally would not have written any of the things that I did write without actually having the benefit of this mentorship that I received here from Robert and Scott and from Margie and from June. So it's really, I know this is not a recruitment session, so everybody who is here is already here. So, if they were outside people, but honestly, I have recommended people to come to the University of Michigan for 20 years. And I really would be doing it more if I was not contractually obligated to recruit for other universities as well. But anyway, this has been just an incredibly transformative, personally and professional place for me. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this incredible community. It is an incredible privilege. And again, I just don't know what life would have been if this did not happen. So thank you, Margie. And by the way, Margie is the only person in the world, except my mother, who sent me a present when I became dean. And you know what? I read that book immediately once you sent it to me. It was very kind that you thought of me. So thank you for that little gesture that actually meant a lot, because I felt totally lost and like, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to make this job work. But anyway, So thank you, June. Thank you for everything you've done. And this is my last thing. So I was just telling this to Robert. So I have, like everyone has these things where you promise yourself never to do something and then you do it. So I had promised myself never to write the textbook, but somehow I got into the textbook business as we speak. And as I'm writing, textbooks are like surveys. It's a little bland writing. It's not as exciting as a scholarly monograph. And when I write the chapters, I was just telling Robert, and this is about all the chapters in the book, you write a paragraph or two, and you think you're speaking matter of fact that these are obvious things, but these things are only obvious because I learned them, for example, from Robert Fishman, and they've become a matter of consensus in the field. But they only became so because people with the insight of Margie and June and Robert actually discovered them for all of us to use as a base for our own work. So the level of growth, intellectual growth, in my opinion, that you can really embark upon starting from this place is really incredible. So again, for 20 years, I want to say thank you. Invite me in 20 years and I can be even more persuasive. How about that? Thank you again. Thank you all. That'd be great.
All you want to do. That should be about that house.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dean Hirt. We really appreciate it. Hi, my name is Angela Dillard. I have had the real pleasure of serving as co-PI on the Egalitarian Metropolis grant along with Robert Fishman. And today's session is about a lot of things, some of which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think a lot of it has really been about teaching and learning from each other, working collaboratively, being students of each other, in some cases explicitly, like Dean Hirt and some of the other people that you'll hear from in this afternoon session, but also being partners with each other. And for 3 of our faculty who have retired, 2 of whom during the COVID years, Robert more recently, we also wanted to use today's session to show a little bit of gratitude, show a little bit of love, say thank you to everything that they've done for us over the years. And of course, we want to do that with a few gifts, which we'll kind of be getting to one by one, starting with Robert. Come on up. That's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Awesome.
But so we wanted to have one of Robert's most distinguished students come back and show a little gratitude, talk a little bit about what he's done. I certainly, have nothing but gratitude for Robert for being co-PI on this grant for some years, which we did not think we were going to be working together quite this long, but it has been a really wonderful adventure. We've got a chance to teach together. We've thought a lot about Detroit together, and I have learned just a shit ton of stuff from Robert Fishman, and I could not be more delighted to give you this little token from all of us who've been associated with the project.
Thank you. Let me give you my hug. It's post-COVID.
I don't think I was supposed to know about this, but I did, and I was reminded of a story involving the scriptwriter and actress Ruth Gordon, and she spent decades and decades, very successful decades, in Hollywood, and finally, for her role in Rosemary's Baby, she actually got an Oscar. And when she got the Oscar, he held it up and said, "This is really encouraging." Thank you for the encouragement.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. So as a historian by both training and inclination, when the idea for a closing session of the symposium came up, I thought it would be really nice to think about the question of what's next, where do we go from here by looking at where we've already been. When I became co-PI with Robert on the Mellon Grant Part 2, I immediately attempted to harness and mobilize a good deal of the past and then current activity on campus, overlapping groups of faculty and graduate students engaged in thinking about the possibilities of a Detroit School for Urban Studies. Cross-campus, cross-school projects like the Egalitarian Metropolis, parts 1 and 2, don't just happen. There's been a good deal of very deliberate planning that's created some absolutely crucial infrastructure around collaboration, around projects like this. Sorry. So there's been a lot of things that have happened on campus that have helped to build this collaborative infrastructure that we've been working inside of from about 2011 to the present. Really starting from about 2009 with the launching of the Semester in Detroit program, which is one of the partners for the Egalitarian Metropolis project. The grant has supported the Detroiters Speak series in the city for the past couple of years now. And it's been our very great pleasure to be in dialogue with this program. The session today is designed to capture, remember, and celebrate the collaborative infrastructure on which the Egalitarian Metropolis Part 2 has rested, and moving from Part 1's focus on multiple cities to the second part's focus primarily on the Detroit metropolitan region. We've invited a lot of people to help us narrate bits and pieces of this history, for which I'm going to provide a really quick gloss here and then let them do the rest of the heavy lifting, which has been pretty much my relationship with a lot of them since the beginning of this project. For me, one of the most amusing parts of this journey was working with faculty colleagues, including Charlie Bright, Margaret Dewar, Lorraine Gutierrez, Larry Gant, Al Young, who was then and is again now chair of the sociology department for LSA, and the deans of 3 colleges on a proposal to take advantage of the presidential interdisciplinary hiring cluster, for which we submitted a 2001 proposal called somewhat prosaically, Urban Studies, Social Inequality and the Prospects for Equity and Sustainability in Southeast Michigan. And I have to tell you, with a title like that, you need a slightly sexier hook if you want to get funded, which is what gave rise, as I recall it, to the notion of a Detroit School of Urban Studies that might sit alongside of the older Chicago and LA schools, but might speak more appropriately to Detroit and Detroit-like cities. The cluster worked. We hired at least 5 faculty colleagues from that grant, a number of whom are still with us on the faculty. As that hiring proceeded, the more we reflected on this idea of a Detroit school, the more enamored and curious we became. Can one really declare oneself a school and get other people to go along with it? The lecture series helped. Dozens of Detroit school lectures, workshops, panels, book launches have occurred under its banner since 2012 to 2020, when we suspended it due to the onset of the COVID pandemic. One of the reasons why we have so many former graduate students on today's panel is to acknowledge the enormous influence they exerted over what this series did and what it became. Here's actually one of the, this is some of the initial questions we started with about, can you actually have a Detroit School of Urban Studies? What would that mean? What would it get you? What might it inhibit you from doing? And there have just been an enormous number of people who come through and been part of this conversation. This is the very first session that was hosted. A couple of the early ones too, when people came in, we asked them to kind of speak to, this question about the Detroit School, talk about their own work, talk about what's really distinctive about studying Detroit and Detroit-like cities. A couple of other really early ones as well. So the early years were followed by a Rackham Graduate School funded Michigan meeting that pulled in additional faculty colleagues like Larry Gant and Martin Murray, and even more blessedly energetic graduate students, as well as sponsorships snaking across the campus, and an international lineup of scholars to sort of think again about Detroit-like cities and other parts of the world. I'll remind those of you in the audience who were involved that we always promise to do learning from Detroit too. The lecture and event series resumed in 2014 and continued across a couple of subsequent years. These are just a few more examples of some of the talks from that time period. And then one focusing primarily on graduate student work, which was really appropriate as the series became wedded to a Rackham interdisciplinary workshop. We even got onto the university's bicentennial year with the theme semester. We inspired books like Taya Miles's Dawn of Detroit, which credits to being kind of around the Detroit School series and thinking about Detroit from so many different kinds of perspectives. We had people internationally thinking about why there's no Detroit in Canada, which was actually one of my favorite talks given. I'll just kind of put that out there real quick. It's been really wonderful. This is really just the tip of the iceberg of the number of people who came through and participated in the series. Moving into its very last year, right before COVID. In fact, Kyle Mays was one of the last people to speak in the series and was actually on the Learning from Detroit conference team, oddly enough, as a graduate student when he's here. And this talk actually laid a lot of the final groundwork for him for the book that he's recently published. And then last but not least, Brenda Snyder gave what we had hoped would be the first in a series of speakers interrogating the notion of an egalitarian metropolis in a direct attempt to bring together these previously parallel projects, so to deliberately intertwine them in this moment. This actually turned out to be the last of the speakers in the entire series. But one possible way to go into the future is to pick up on this idea and spin that forward. As the Detroit School series went into hiatus, the Egalitarian Metropolis continued to support a range of initiatives and projects, including the Egalitarian Metropolis course that's housed in the residential college, whose third iteration is being taught this semester by Anna Ascarello, the current Fishman Fellow, who's supported by the grant, and Vince Carducci, as well as many of the projects that have been highlighted across the symposium over the last several sessions. So that's just a quick overview. We have a lot of folks joining us to fill in the details, talk about others who are involved and how, in an ongoing effort to document where we've been as a way of helping us think about what we might do next. I'm going to welcome our panelists back and up in waves. So the early years, the middle period, and the Egalitarian Metropolis 2 era. It's a little artificial because there's a lot of overlap between these people and these moments of the project. I'm going to let them more fully introduce themselves, tell you what they're doing now with their titles, We have a few questions that we're using as prompts to help them reflect back over this. A big part of this session is also about documenting this history. We really want to make sure that we package everything well as the grant period comes to a close. And we've been thinking a lot about what it means to bring projects to an end and to end them in really generative ways in which bits and pieces might be spun off in the future. We feel strongly that a lot of that is a real attempt to try and get this history right. So first up, our first wave, I have a real pleasure to welcome Eric Seymour, Meagan Elliott, Patrick Cooper-McCann, and RJ. Why don't you guys come on up?
Yeah, do we fill it up this way?
Yeah. Do you want to just introduce yourselves quickly? Tell us where you are now.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Meagan Elliott. If I haven't met you, I live in the city of Detroit, and I also work for the city of Detroit. I'm the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, so I oversee the $2.4 billion in grants and development funds for the city, and matching those with different initiatives that we're trying to accomplish right now. Prior to that, I was the Chief Parks Planner for about 7 years, working on how to really accomplish some major public space initiatives in the city, and got my doctorate in sociology here and learned from so many of you, and really excited to reflect on that time especially today.
Hello, I'm Patrick Cooper-McCann. I finished up my PhD here very early in 2019. And since then, I've been an assistant professor of urban studies and planning at Wayne State in Detroit. And was involved in the first two waves of this initiative, and actually going all the way back to semester Detroit. So happy to talk about all of that today.
Hi, I'm Eric Seymour. I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at the Detroit School at Rutgers. So I've made the interesting transition to the East Coast after spending so much time thinking about what is distinctive about places in the Midwest and elsewhere that have not historically received quite as much attention. And so I think that there are things that we have, and I've learned with Margaret, with June, with others here that have been very useful and applicable in bringing back to the coast. We can return to that more in a moment. I teach courses in housing policy and economics, and it's a delight to return here.
Hi, my name is RJ Koscielniak. I finished in 2020, and I am currently an assistant professor of urban regional planning at Eastern Michigan University. So just about 5 miles away. It was a hell of a drive over here, a whole different world. I haven't been in this building in 3 years for a variety of reasons. So my research focuses specifically on the production of decline and the relationship between supply chains and the process of extraction and destruction in declining cities. And I was drawn here not as a Michigander, but as a proud Rust Belter, Midwest, born and bred. And my sort of focus broadly has been, I came to study Michigan and Detroit because one day I'll have to study Phoenix and Las Vegas. And so thinking about decline not as sort of something that belongs to a region, but as a feature and a form of urbanization in the 21st century.
Okay, so can I ask you all to just reflect a little out loud about being involved in different aspects of these projects, how it shaped your graduate education, how it's maybe shaped the kinds of things that you've gone on to do?
I nominate Eric. because you were involved in I think writing the proposal maybe to do the first lecture series.
I was, and so I have to kind of plumb the depths of my memory here. Things that happened during your time of graduate school can be kind of a haze. So, I started my journey in the PhD program here in 2010. And these were heady times to be studying Detroit-like places. There were many scholars already at the university, many that would come here. Myself, I just made the journey from Florida most recently to come here to study decline. I'm from Buffalo. And so I think that this was a fantastic opportunity to really do the thing that it was intended to do, right? To be able to have some excellent hires across disciplines here. But it's also a way to kind of focus and harness some of this energy with all these scholars that were in the area and beyond in a way that would really exceed the possibilities of what you could have at an academic conference. And without having to have us as early scholars being on the hook to present finished academic research at ACSP or one of these other conferences. And so having the ability to take time to speak after presentations and go out to dinner with folks that you've seen some of these things here with the faculty colleagues, it was a great way for us as graduate students to be able to test out ideas without, I think, any fear of recourse or the kind of academic self-doubt. And it was also a fantastic mentoring activity as well for showing us how to do these things that we are doing now as faculty and in other positions. How is it that we can convene people with the spirit of open mind and generosity so that we know, as we do, that the work that we produce as a community of scholars is greater than the sum of its parts. And so I'm not giving a great deal of specific detail about the first wave of the Detroit School, but there are many scholars that I'd only read from, and being able to meet with them and have them sit and take my ideas seriously and give me feedback that I can incorporate into my own research proposals and beyond. It was just an incredibly satisfying and rewarding experience.
I think one of the things that I personally benefited so much from was the kind of hybrid nature of the Detroit School. So I think that the title alone really encouraged people from across the entire campus to join in on some of those, even just like, workshops across grad students of what you were studying and what you were trying to get out. We don't realize how often we take for granted, as Professor Hirt mentioned, the things that we know and understand from all of our faculty that we work with, and to have, for me, coming from sociology and getting my master's in urban planning in the middle of that really challenged that kind of hybridity for me. And then bringing in this workshop where we had folks from all over campus doing very different things, and then challenging some of the theoretical assumptions behind that as part of that experience was really, really beneficial. Felt very supportive, and it felt like the kind of core group that I could turn to as I was, kind of struggling to work through a lot of my own research questions. So thank you guys and everyone else that participated during that time.
Because what I'm thinking about, like substantively, I think what was very interesting about organizing a series like this, as a grad student taking like urban theory seminars, is that it really made me quite reflective about how it is we learn anything about cities and how we're supposed to do it, right? Like one of our first speakers was Robert Beauregard, who said that the idea of a Detroit School of Urbanism is absurd. You're on the wrong track. Stop now. This is not how you learn about cities. I actually kind of agree with him in a certain. I agree that what he kind of set up a trope of what School of Urbanism is, which is to say that you pick a city like Chicago or Los Angeles, and then you say, or Miami or Las Vegas, Mumbai, you choose your city, and then you say it has some defining qualities about it that mean that it's at the vanguard of history, and all other cities will soon be this one. And that's a really dumb way to describe Detroit. And so I agreed with him in that sense. But it challenged us, I think, to think about, well, what value then is there in talking about this? And that's thinking more about what is a kind of school of thought, like as a practical matter, like how does knowledge about cities get produced? And in that sense, something like what we did here is very valuable. Bringing a lot of people together to talk about a place in depth from a lot of different perspectives is how knowledge gets generated, and in a comparative perspective. So it was kind of had that like meta quality of we were learning with and about Detroit, and a lot of the sessions were geared toward, that's all academic research is, very specific topics, learning about some slice of Detroit's history or present, whether it's from a sociologist or an anthropologist or a historian. But the undercurrent of it is thinking about what aspects of Detroit's reality or the rest of reality are absent from the kind of body of knowledge out there in urban studies today, and also like how should we go about formulating research what's the way that we ought to be trying to do urban studies research. So for me, it was it was a really kind of important, for me kind of theoretically and in terms of thinking about how to do research, in addition to the fact that I have now done a lot of research on Detroit and a lot of the ideas came out of the seminars and sessions.
I think that there was this remarkable moment in the US, sort of 2008, 2009, where there's this conversation about decline, vacancy, abandonment really started taking shape. The American Assembly, which several of the faculty participated in and helped shape, really taking seriously that these legacy cities or shrinking cities were a significant part of basically the American experience, but also something that had been understudied, neglected, ignored. And I think partly because we were, or many scholars were sort of obsessed with this idea that decline was about absence, right? Decline is about flight. Decline's about things leaving, right? And this is the remainder. And not that there's actually processes and forms of making money and extraction, right? All alive and animated in those places. And so I might be what you call very small portion. I think many of us are probably part of this, sort of a nerd for decline and blight. I was getting my master's in St. Louis and I ran a community vacancy summit. And then I discovered that there was this thing called reclaiming vacant properties. And I flew to Cleveland to participate in this conference. I got dragged to Portland, Oregon, and I lived there for a little while. And it occurred to me that I didn't want to be on the West Coast, because of real estate prices. And also it's wet all the time. No thanks. I'd rather be cold and wet all the time. And so, I was looking at places to be where I wanted to get a PhD. And, the University of Michigan was offering something that nobody else had, right? This community of scholars, but also like this very serious engagement with these questions, right? That it wasn't about just what's left. It wasn't just about what's the remainder, right? It's not this sort of apocalyptic story, right? It's about sort of how are these systems and processes and institutions operating and how we're actually assigning value to the relationality of those processes, right? That it's not just like, well, there's Detroit, there's St. Louis, there's Cleveland, right? How do we think about systems broadly? How do we think scale, right? And so I showed up in 2012 and Cooper and Dr. Seymour, also Dr. Cooper, they took me around. And I think I was probably one of the first like decline sickos that had come in as a PhD candidate or a PhD prospective student. And I got to see Terry Schwartz talk about tossing seed mixes on vacant lots so that you could identify what kind of brownfield remediation was required, right? Like these sort of wacky, incredibly significant power, like overwhelming kinds of stories that nobody else has had. And so I feel very lucky that I was able to land here and work for as long as I did, maybe too long. But yeah, I mean, it was really about like how this culture of critical thinking, something I tell my students a lot is that like we have to sort of get over this sort of passive inheritance of how we think about how cities operate, right? Like we should be inheriting these things, but critically, right? We should be scrutinizing them and being able, taking the time to dismantle them. And I think the Detroit School was really sort of at the forefront of taking seriously that the wrong questions were being asked.
And then both, not only in Detroit, not only regionally and nationally, but internationally as well. I think, watching that Michigan meeting, learning from Detroit come into existence, having people from all over the world, especially so many colleagues from Germany, come in and sort of think comparatively about some of the same kinds of questions was, I think, just kind of remarkable. It was a remarkable thing to attend. And then to see you all help to organize, and then to see you all publish on along with Margaret. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. Natural public speaker. So, and I want to make sure that I'm actually attributing which idea to which person, because there are so many ideas I think were taking form as part of the kind of conversation among the community of scholars, taking decline seriously. And I think that's the part that's really important. Taking it on its own terms, not taking it as simply the mirror image of urban growth or investment, not thinking that I think a lot about investment. I study housing, whether a real estate market or a city is either attractive to investment or whether it repels investment, right? These types of simple conceptual frameworks are not adequate to explain the types of things that I think we had clues about. There would be no reason to conduct research if we had all the answers, but a lot of puzzles that we needed to address. And the book chapter is a great way for us to put that thought together and lay a research agenda that we've, I think, achieved in some sense, right? We've had, myself and others here have published coming out of that mode of thinking of developing a conceptual framework or trying to interrogate all of our assumptions, all of the easy explanations for what we may think is occurring in these particular places, because again, we saw that those assumptions fail under the weight of scrutiny. And so that chapter was a great activity of really focusing our thought at this crucial time, those particular matters.
This moves slightly forward to the middle period of our wave structure here.
But for me, one of the takeaways, so we with Margie, I think 3 or 4 of us collaborate on this book chapter about learning from Detroit, different ways in which our research might be filling in gaps that, that were present in the broader kind of field, especially of urban planning, but also urban sociology related disciplines that were only really dealing with questions of growth. And treating decline as just something that
Is awaiting new growth.
as opposed to kind of a subject of its own, kind of in its own right, meriting its own study. But one of the things that I took away from it is a sort of light bulb of like, there are so many different graduate students right now approaching this question of learning from Detroit. And so at the conclusion of the first 2 years of the lecture series, a little light bulb went off in my head when I realized that a significant amount of money was left over from planning the conference. And I proposed to Angela that we keep it going and that it would be my salary. And that turned out to have worked out very well for a year. And then we also got funding through Rackham as a Rackham interdisciplinary workshop. And kind of going back to this idea of like, how do we do urban studies? How does it get done? Well, one thing that I realized is that there's a sort of attraction to disaster, if you will, right? So like when Katrina happened, 100 dissertations were written on New Orleans, right? When we were doing this series, Detroit was going through bankruptcy. It was the poster child in some ways of the worst effects of the Great Recession. And when I started the Rackham Interdisciplinary Workshop, I decided it would be interesting to find out, like, well, who's doing dissertations on Detroit? And we started within the context of U of M, but then we tried to kind of spread out. And ultimately, I don't remember anymore, but I mean, I think we had about 80 doctoral students identified at maybe 30 different universities throughout the world. And almost all of them were spending at least some of their time in the city, even if they were in Italy or Germany. They were coming here to do their research, and we were inviting them to come in and join this. So it's like a rotating cast of doctoral students from all over. And that was another really instructive part of this process, because you see, for example, there's a lot of value in comparative research to take Detroit and put it alongside another city. But on the other hand, many of these people came with only the slightest understanding of what Detroit meant. They were in a context of deindustrialization in, maybe it was in Italy or France, and they came here and they concluded, wow, my city is nothing like Detroit. Very interesting. Others had a deeper, kind of theoretical approach to it and were able to really, say something new, but it brought us into conversation with people from around the world. And then by the time that the kind of Rackham Interdisciplinary Workshop was wrapping up, that pool of dissertators was starting to shrink because they had moved on to the next major news story. And you can also see how like these dissertations kind of come in ebbs and flows based around what's the big story, what's driving interest in the field of urban studies. So that to me was a major, something I learned kind of beyond just the chapter we wrote.
I think maybe one piece that I'll add is just this question of interrogating decline and what decline means. My research has been more ethnographic and in-depth interviews. So I was regularly having very, very long conversations with Detroiters who had lived in the North End neighborhood for many decades. And their way of narrating decline was very, very different than a lot of what we had talked about kind of structurally at the university. So I think that kind of, for me, helped me to further dig into what I was learning from residents and what that meant for this kind of question of the Detroit school. More specifically, that, you know, no one ever really thinks of themselves as living in a space of decline. I mean, even if there's very objective kind of facts to determine the 7 houses next to me no longer have residents in them, that's not like a kind of a viable outlook on life, right? So you're always narrating about the like peak of, you know, kind of the historical moment when you remember the most residents on your block, and also focus really heavily on the concept of gentrification. When you look at the kind of, you know, kind of quantitative aspects of how you might measure gentrification, none of those were present in that time in the North End. But when you look at the cultural dimensions of what gentrification means and how that gets expressed and how people think about what it means to be part of a neighborhood and part of a community, there was so much richness there that helped me to further define what cultural displacement really looked like and how that could be articulated and understood and how that might influence other pieces of how we think about the concept of gentrification as a whole. So that was also a kind of a, you know, the sense of decline wasn't really always there. So
I think this is a good place to pause and do a little bit more gratitude. So I'm gonna ask Eric and Meagan to give me a hand with this.
Thank you, Angela. So I am absolutely delighted to be, if I'm audible here, to return to Ann Arbor and to be part of honoring Margie and all of the deeply influential and powerful work that Margie has produced and part of. You know, Margie is and remains the leading expert on returning vacant properties to productive use, right? But among other topics as well. I mean, a decades-long career that's been highly productive and fruitful, and also reflects a generous spirit of working with graduate students, among others. I've had the opportunity to not just work on that book chapter with you, but also on my first peer-reviewed journal publication, and being able to have that experience, being able to have Margie help me to interpret and not feel totally discouraged from the first round of peer review that I've ever had in my life. But just what a rich, I was going to use the word legacy, which is very complicated in the setting, legacy cities thing, but this rich legacy, right? Us being here, right, and returning and just being part of that community. And so I think I'm over 1 minute, and I'll turn it over to Meg, but thank you so much.
And Margie, just so you know, when Eric and I learned that we were both getting to kind of give you this award, I created a false dichotomy, was like, since you're in academia and I'm no longer, why don't you talk about what Margie's contributed in academia, and I'll talk about kind of all the applied public policy impact she's had. But I realized in thinking about your career and everything you've done, that you've never operated that way. It has always been a smooth and seamless kind of work between both of those worlds in ways that some of us have struggled with, and you've done it with such finesse, and it's been amazing to even, you know, kind of now at the city be front row to literally every single policy or program that we implement that has to do with housing stability has the touch of your work, which is such an amazing achievement on its own. And I know that's not just, you know, you've led to the production of things at the national level, the state level. It's been amazing for all of us to get the opportunity to work with you and learn from you, and get to present this award to you. So thank you again.
I'm like, Robert, I'm kind of speechless. I do want to say that it's been so interesting to hear you reflect on the Detroit School of Urban Studies and what we learned together in that. It really was a lot. I think the evolution that we came to after Bob Beauregard jolted us out of our initial idea was that Detroit is an extreme place. The metro area is extreme, and that extreme character of the highest poverty in the nation, sometimes Cleveland outdoes it, more disinvestment in property than anywhere, maybe except St. Louis, and in this city, in a large city in this country, a majority Black population of more segregation than any other city except maybe Chicago and Milwaukee. You know, this city's always at the top of those kinds of extremes, and that revealed the extremes, revealed features of cities that other people hadn't been talking about. Like what Meagan just talked about, where everyone was talking about gentrification as pushing people out of their homes because they couldn't afford them. Well, values weren't changing. So that wasn't what was going on with people's strong feeling that it was being gentrified. So what was gentrification beyond the money? And that went along with everything these folks did about always thinking, what do we see here that people haven't been talking about because it's exposed here? What can we make of that? How does it apply elsewhere? We bet it's happening in Chicago neighborhoods too, that kind of thing. It was incredibly rewarding to work with you folks, and thank you.
So Cooper has kind of got us thinking a little bit about that middle period, and we have a couple more folks to invite up to, riff a little bit more, reflect a little bit more about what happened once these folks started to leave the university, PhDs in hand for the next big things in their life. And as we continue to think about the series and other kinds of things that we wanted to do together. So it's a pleasure to welcome both Jasmine and Rob. I want to pass that one. Hang on to that one, you guys. All right, you guys want to introduce yourselves? Talk a little bit about how you entered as part of this narrative.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine. I'm a doctoral student in the Joint Sociology and Public Policy program. I came in co-running the Detroit School series with Rob and Alexa, and I'm also a research fellow at the Center for Racial Justice at the School of Public Policy, where we analyze a representative household survey based in Detroit as well as in Ypsilanti.
And my name is Robert Pfaff. I recently received my PhD from Calvin College in 2021. And I am now a visiting assistant professor at the Meixin Goodman School of Public Affairs and Education in Cleveland. But focusing on issues of transportation disinvestment, decline, inequality, and racial segregation that's influenced by lack of transportation access.
Sorry, Dan, it's the number, it's this other thing with the red light, press number 1.
Good call. So I think for both of you, can you elaborate on the role of graduate students, support from the Rackham interdisciplinary workshop, as memory serves? You all kind of, well, and that actually one of the things that happened over the years is that the outgoing people who had been organizing for the workshops and playing a big role had to kind of recruit their own replacements. Right, so there's kind of been a handoff over the years, but can the two of you talk a little bit about how you got recruited and some of the work you did on organizing?
Thanks, Cooper. I remember when I was a prospective PhD student, I met with Cooper and heard about the Detroit School Symposium, or the Detroit School series, which is now sort of, I think, culminating in the symposium. And I, in turn, met with a prospective student, Christine Hwang, and told her all about it. And now she's deeply involved, and I'm not at all surprised. But I think it's important to think about legacy building in the sense of not only working with grad students, but the community of scholars that influence us and other great thinkers at the university. Because we quite literally are helping to do the work, but we are standing on the shoulders of people that are mentoring us and supporting us and giving us these phenomenal opportunities and teaching us to, I think, follow a lot of our gut instincts with a lot of different academic study. And, you know, it started with, I think, Cooper providing a little bit of push into helping, promising that it wouldn't be too much work because Lydia would also be there doing work. Lydia Williden, not able to join us. And then I helped recruit Alexa Eisenberg and Jasmine. And so it was sort of like an interesting transition between all the grad students, but I certainly see the first wave of people, and indeed some others that aren't even here, as very early influencers that, you know, impacted the formation of this community of scholars.
Yeah, so I was, I think, the last person asked to join the student leadership team before COVID hit. And it was a really organic transition, basically. I mean, to an earlier point, when I got to grad school, I was in sociology telling people, I want to study this about Detroit. And in sociology, people are hesitant to let you study Detroit because they think of it as an anomaly. And so for me, I quite literally couldn't have done my research without the Detroit School series because I had to go somewhere else to come back to sociology and make the case that I can study this. There's a lot to learn from it, lessons from Detroit, and that it's important for other cities to understand Detroit. So I've been going to a lot of the lecture series my first and second year, and Lydia and Rob and Alexa were like, "Hey, I see you a lot. Would you like to be more involved?" And so it was just a really, I am also very grateful for the work that you all did and that these professors have done, because I don't think the first part of my grad school could have happened without it.
You guys talk about what was your favorite session to organize?
The Kyle Mays session, I think, was really, really great. He's a historian by training. And the book that he was talking about at that time was a kind of linking Indigenous history with Blackness in the city of Detroit. And so I thought it was a really good sort of next step in a bunch of series where we had been talking about property. And I think the reality in the US is that property is racialized, and it goes back to how we stole property from tribal land. So it was a really, really, I think, great connection. It was sort of outside of the housing of Detroit, but still really about race and place. And so that was maybe the only session I was around to organize before the pandemic, but a really, really fun.
I'm gonna cheat and say two. And I do this because I enjoyed actually moving, I think, a little bit in this middle period and towards the end of perhaps what egalitarian metropolis would have eventually culminate with, towards a more national vision and thinking about how we can take the Detroit School sort of on the road is what we were discussing right before COVID. And we had put together and used our funding for that year to create a system at the Urban Affairs Association conference in April, which was canceled. But we gathered a bunch of scholars, not only from Detroit, but nationally. I think we had people from California, from New York, from Boston, or Detroit, all sort of like speaking on issues of decline as it impacted both education and also history and housing. And we put 2 panels together. We're funding the researchers to go to the conference and sort of presenting the Detroit School nationally. And I really enjoyed, I think, the possibility of having that larger national conversation about how decline fits into those narratives. And then I think the second one was a little bit of a throwback, but we co-planned it with Poverty Solutions, and it was the Road Out of Poverty Transportation and Economic Mobility Symposium that they hosted, which we sort of like co-sponsored and added our name to. But they brought in like very big name speakers like then Secretary of Transportation Anthony Fox, so 2 handshakes away from Obama at the time. And I remember just being like awestruck as a graduate student, being sort of like allowed into the same room as the transportation secretary, as someone who studies transportation. It was an absolutely phenomenal like lunch conversation and a really interesting insight into what my research would eventually produce about the ways that decline, disinvestment in transportation infrastructure really kind of influences issues and access to urban equity. And it was a much larger symposium that had a bunch of conferences, and I think the Detroit School hosted one specific panel. But in terms of being able to co-organize that with Poverty Solutions, that was probably my favorite event, besides Kyle and Mason.
Yeah, Kyle was great. There's one point where I think somebody asked him about, well, how do you solve this problem of land in a place like Detroit? And he said, give it back. And everybody just gasped. It was really a packed room of people who were just so startled by that. And Robin, something like you talked about the idea of sending people to a national conference was such an interesting thing to do. They did a ton of work organizing current graduate students, faculty here, faculty elsewhere. We read a lot of the proposals, we provided feedback. It's a mentoring opportunity, and I think really would have been an exciting thing to see happen, you know, on a national scale. So I think it was a really, could be one of those things, you know, as we think to the future about trying to pull something like that off. But for the earlier folks, did you all have a favorite session that you wanted to talk a little bit about?
It's hard to think of.
Not one of the crazy ones.
Right. Well, it's hard to think of it like just one. It's also hard to remember all of them because there were probably 50 plus events over the course of all of these years. I'm partial to the events where I felt like there was a lot of like active thinking and deliberation and conversation in the room. So one I would say is at the very beginning, there was a session held at I think at the Michigan Union with June and with Charlie Bright and with others, like really actively thinking through and trying to come up with a definition of what a Detroit School of Urbanism would be. You know, so for example, like, you know, I remember in George Galsker being part of that conversation, pushing back on the idea that we would define it as like the city, to think of, you know, if the focus is on decline, that it needs to be situated in a more metropolitan context. And, you know, kind of exploding like the city suburban distinction has been something that's been really important in my thinking about Metro Detroit all the way through to the present. I think the session with Robert Beauregard was actually great because he came in, you know, kind of in a mood to fight, and in a way he was, it was a straw man argument. He was sort of like, okay, I haven't been part of these conversations, but I just want to make sure you're not doing it wrong. And kind of launched into a tirade, but it was instructive and it got people talking. Jason Hackworth was great. You know, and I think that, you know, he's acknowledged in some of his recent work that he's been influenced. You know, he even like, you know, I've met with him a couple times since then, you know, like even like listen to some of the, you know, audio and video that we put on the internet. Like people were following this series who weren't necessarily here. But, you know, and his grad students were kind of coming through and participating in the workshop. So, you know, we had a few sessions like that where it really felt like we were sparking really interesting conversations. And same thing with the graduate writing workshop. You know, those were often very interesting because you're seeing somebody's work in a very raw form. Graduate students are notorious for like pulling out of such things. They're like, oh yeah, I'd love to share a chapter. I'll have it done sign me up for April, and then April comes and they're like, I would never possibly share my work. It's not ready for daylight, I won't be there, sorry. But those who were brave enough to share unfinished work, it sparked really, interesting conversations because people were like, oh, I either substantively, I had no idea about that specific neighborhood or that issue that you're addressing, or, oftentimes we kind of go around and be talking about like the different kind of theoretical touchstones that we're bringing to it. And so maybe like somebody had, interesting insights from, say, sociology that the planner, wasn't familiar with, or from anthropology and so forth. So those are the kinds of sessions that meant a lot to me.
I was just going to strongly second that, I distinctly remember that meeting, and I think it was in the union where, and I think that some of those, maybe principles is too strong of a word, but some of these characteristics that might help define what's distinct about declining places appeared in George Culster's paper subsequently. And I'm also thinking about the sessions we had with Bill Tabb when he was here. That's also like another publication. There's also a lot of stories that we can tell outside of the room about. I think that those opportunities to, again, meet somewhat informally, like through the writing workshops, extremely productive, and getting to, well, I don't know if this was kind of a moment with the return of urban sociology or the return of urban sociology in Michigan or something like that, but there was definitely like a noticeable change in the zeitgeist, being part of that turn as people who are all interested in taking cities more seriously and these types of urban environments. It was great to have those conversations with all the fantastic sociology books here too.
I agree with, having a little bit more of an engagement with sociology, a little bit more historians. One of my favorite sessions was actually with Myles, who was my first graduate student at the University of Minnesota. So it was really wonderful having her here at the University of Michigan for a number of years. And when she published her book, Dawn of Detroit, which is a chronicle of slavery and freedom in the city of the Straits, she actually credited a lot of kind of listening into these Detroit school conversations, which I don't think I had realized that she had been so influenced by. So it was a really wonderful session. It also, I think, reminded us of one of the early principles about the kinds of things that we wanted to do with the Detroit school, which was to talk about race, which was not to let any of these conversations happen without talking about race and racism in Detroit in the metropolitan area. So it was a really nice way of trying to weave that in as a theme across these multiple years. This might actually be a good place to pause and do our third gift for the third person. Okay, thinking about what I've certainly learned from her book about race and how the impact of that on the city of Detroit. So for this one, I think I am having Cooper and Christine give a hand.
So we've been asked to present a gift to Chamberlain. And I can't possibly express everything I would say in 1 minute, but I was thinking of two things to say. One is that I think June's work must be among, if not the most cited in all of the research that everyone here has done on Detroit. I can't have done the work that I've done on Detroit without her work as the foundation of it. I assign June's work in virtually every class that I teach. I first encountered your history of planning in Detroit as an undergraduate and taking a class on the history of Detroit with Stephen Ward, and encountered it again in the semester Detroit program in grad school. The other thing I would say, is that June's been such a model of who I think we would all like to be as academics. Extremely ethical person, hardworking, honest, and just yeah, all around fantastic researcher.
Well, I want to borrow something, Robert, that you said about June at her book launch. And you said June's the only person who would write a memoir and not have it be about herself. And I was really lucky to overlap with June as she was retiring from Michigan. And because we had that little bit of time where we're both in the halls of Hoffman, I really got to have a new role model and a new friend. I think she has this really unpretentious way of really understanding and helping people. In one of my first conversations with her, she said, I think you're really interested in the spiritual space. And I remember thinking how that kind of shifted me from being interested in what I was studying to deeply interested in what I was studying. So thank you.
Yeah, this was such a special time. I was so fortunate to be able to work with so many of these folks, particularly Margie. You know, we're sitting there like twins because I felt like Margie was my sister, and it was really special to be a part of this. But I did want to mention something. This was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, someone gave me an award. I don't remember what, I think historians did Sacred, or someone gave me an award. And my daughter called me up and she said, "Oh, Mom, congratulations. I'm so proud of you. You won this award." And the first thing out of my mouth, I said, "But Kimba, look at Detroit." And she said, "But Mom, your award, aren't you happy?" And I said, "But I never expected to be here with Detroit." And she mentioned this to one of her colleagues, and her colleague said, "Well, this is sort of like a midlife, actually 60-ish, 70-ish life crisis, and this is what people at that stage of their life, because you start out thinking you're going to save something and then you can't." So I go back. There was a time I thought we could. And there was a phase in academia that was placed. But then I must say, I look at this beautiful array of young scholars and just the symposia that we had, when I saw so many extraordinary practitioners, I was so elevated. Feelings were so elevated that this is just perfect. Thank you so much.
I remember thinking, when I first got involved, I was like, "Oh my God, I get to work with June Thomas." So cool. And I was like, "Oh, and she's married to Richard Thomas, and a great historian. This is so cool." So it's been, certainly being able to be in dialogue around with both of them over these years has really been a wonderful experience for me. So Christine has joined us. Yay. We also have May and Myles that we're welcoming. More so as that group of people who really took us into the egalitarian metropolis. And as June was saying, I think, right, a lot of us got to that point where we really felt like we need more engagement, direct engagement, collaborative engagement, mutual engagement with partners working in Detroit to be able to support projects and partnerships that had a community engagement component that was about listening to people in the city, being part of a conversation from that perspective of deep knowledge and commitment, which had a lot to do with trying to crisscross these projects. As Robert and I became co-PIs on the second part of the egalitarian metropolis that was going to focus more heavily on Detroit. And the three of you have been involved in various aspects of that project. Can you guys introduce yourselves fully? Tell us what you're working on and what you've been working on with the egalitarian metropolis.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, my name is Yuan, and I'm a third-year PhD candidate in urban regional planning. And I've been working with Larissa Larson on the spatializing space project as one of the aspects of this egalitarian metropolis project as a whole. And I'm also working with Dan and Anna, which was very delightful to work with them to help with facilitating this symposium.
Hello, I'm Myles Zhang. I'm a second-year PhD student in architecture, and I was really honored to work with Robert Fishman on racializing space, both as a lens through which to understand Detroit, and as a broader prism through which to understand Detroit-like spaces, and the production of decline in the American city to really denaturalize how we understand Detroit and to see it as a product of larger social, economic, political forces.
I'm Christine Hwang, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in urban planning. So I've been most directly involved with this project through the Koscielniak State project, and I've collaborated with historians and co-authored with David Helps, a PhD candidate in history, on looking at Detroit through the lens of racial capitalism and settler colonialism and onto the present.
Great. And so the three of you had kind of less of a prompt, but I'm wondering if you just have questions for the folks on this side, or kind of thinking about maybe intersections between the Detroit School and the kinds of things that you've been thinking about, and what you think might be some ideas for the future. Totally putting you all on the spot.
I think I have a question related to Jean Manning's observation when she got the award, and she said, "Look at Detroit." And I think about the larger role that I, as an aspiring scholar, and we as scholars play within society. Hope that as a young person, that the work that I will do will change the world, will transform the world. And then to see myself as a smaller peg in this much larger machine of capitalism or economics or the population loss of Detroit. And so, on the one hand, I have this drive toward, I want to be an activist scholar. On the other hand, I have a pessimism when I think about the larger forces of racial capitalism and economics that oppress Detroit. And so, as emerging scholars a few years ahead of me, how do you deal with the pessimism?
I lean into it. To be perfectly honest. So over the last couple of years, sort of a roundabout way to answer this question, there's been this sort of ongoing debate about how we're going to get water to the American Southwest, right? Show of hand, does anybody know what the solution is currently? It's to build a pipeline from the Great Lakes to Phoenix. And the argument has been, well, either we're going to take water from the Great Lakes, right? Or those places are going to rapidly decline when they run out of water. And then all of those people are going to move back to the Midwest, which will then solve our population problem, right? We will now be appealing and attractive. The reality, of course, is that if you are a student of history, urban planning, urban studies, any of that, you know that when population flight does occur, it's usually those with resources, right? It's usually those with wealth. It's those with the means to be able to leave. So actually we can see sort of how we're already setting up this region to become the sort of sand belt, if you will. I mean, drought belt, whatever you want to say. And that the people left behind in Phoenix, right, in Las Vegas, will be some of the poorest people in this country, and it will also skew towards people of color. We already know this is going to happen, right? So by leaning into the pessimism, we can already start saying like, hey, maybe we should be planning for this sooner than later, right? And I think I agree with the sentiment from June. I think that, you know, so much of the way that we frame our engagement with cities is like, oh, I'm going to revitalize it. Oh, I'm going to fix it, right? Like save it. And sometimes when we start from that position, we are seeing glimmers of hope when we should be actually much more sober-minded about what it is that we're observing. Right, and I think having that kind of outrage and anger about these systems is deeply appropriate. Anyway, roundabout answer. Decline is coming. It's you know, like we are living in the climate apocalypse. Sorry to burst your bubble. You know, people used to say that, you know, when the American economy, you know, got a cold, right? Detroit got the flu. I think, you know, the American economy is going to have the flu. What that means for Detroit, right, is one thing, but what it means for all of these urban places, right? How we think about urbanization relative to decline is going to become a very significant both policy problem, but also philosophical problem, right? What do you do when we can't sustain civilization anymore?
Dark.
Yep.
Okay. On the flip side. It's fine. I so appreciate this. So I'm just an antidote, I think, to the pessimism, because I truly, I don't have a pessimistic bone in my body, which can sometimes be challenging in other ways, but I also approach everything in my life with a ton of humility. And I think that is why, to June's point, like you can't, I guess I never thought that there was a point of, you know, saving anyone or any place or anything, but every engagement you have with every single person teaches you something and you're learning from that. And there are about 1,000,001 ways to plug into that with the things that you're learning every day at the level of your local government. So I'm not also trying to pitch that people come work for the city of Detroit. But if you look at this moment in time, to the question of kind of where do we go next, the level of public investment with the American Rescue Plan Act and the infrastructure bill so far outsizes anything we've seen in generations for cities. And the amount of time we have to spend it is so limited. It is a perfect time and opportunity to apply every critical thinking skill that we have and everything we know about how cities operate on a structural level to how are we utilizing these resources most appropriately, and where can we criticize that? I mean, I would love to have, even if it was like, you know, deeply critical from folks, you know, sitting up here with me to call me every day and say, Meagan, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, I would very much appreciate that, you know? So I think that that's where I draw a lot of my optimism from. That like the amount of investment that's happening in cities right now, and it has such flexibility associated with it. And you can see the across the country, the really diverse ways that people are interpreting that flexibility, depending on kind of the local political landscape. But I think that's my optimism plus humility stance.
This is a very good question. I have two responses to it. One is I do feel deeply pessimistic, intellectually speaking, unfortunately. But where I've tried to balance that is with teaching, because I don't, you know, I'm about 5 years into teaching prospective urban planners and urban studies students at Wayne State. And I don't like leaving the classroom feeling depressed. And I don't like leaving the classroom feeling like I have depressed a group of people. And I remember thinking about this series, like I had, of all of the sessions, I recall George Galster's, whose office I now occupy, as by far the most depressing presentation I've seen. And And I don't have much to dispute factually with his assessment of where Detroit was in that position. But it was just like really, really troubling to hear students raise their hand and say like, and what did we do? And his response was basically like, well, I'm an economist. And as far as I can tell, these conditions will continue. You know, like it was like, there was no action, there was no response. It was just, this is what I think is the situation. It's really bad, you know, and it's like people walked out of here looking like, you know, heartbroken. And so what I tried to do is be as honest as possible in my research and to really like dig deep and try to fundamentally understand what's happening. But in teaching, I find that every semester, I'm oriented more and more rather to like, what is exactly happening right now to how do you make change? I don't necessarily think that the students are going to go out and radically alter the conditions that they're encountering, but like my community development class, for example, went from being largely about the housing crisis or, you know, contaminated and vacant land or, you know, abandonment of property, et cetera, to being about community organizing and about effective advocacy and about how local government works, how you influence politicians, how do you know, like different strategies and approaches to making change. Mainly because I feel a lot better when the students leave feeling like they learned something useful and they leave feeling some sense of optimism that they have tools to approach the conditions that they're going to encounter. And they're going to realize the challenges that they're going to face regardless. So a little bit less emphasis on the bleak reality of how we got here and a little bit more about what might leave students feeling empowered. The other thing I was going to say is that just in the 5 years that I've been teaching, I have been struck too by the fact that reality changes. So I would hardly say that Detroit is a revitalized city. I think we're getting closer to Cleveland, which, as you pointed out, has an even higher poverty rate than Detroit. But it, you know, nevertheless, it was striking to me going to Cleveland for the first time about probably, I don't know, somewhere like 12, 15 years ago. It's like, oh, this is a city a lot like Detroit, but without all of the boarded up, vacant, abandoned buildings, without a lot of like the visible markers of like, you know, things in social terms are very similar, and yet there were very different outcomes. And in Detroit in the past 5 years, like I've had to completely change my lecture about, say, tax foreclosure, because there's a whole wealth of programs addressing that issue that have radically reduced the number of occupied properties going into foreclosure, thanks in part to the work that Margie and others, you know, and Eric have done. I had to change my lecture talking about property values because they're going up, not down. And that's something interesting to discuss. I have to change how I'm talking about property abandonment because property isn't being abandoned. It is to some extent because of eviction and other things, but the number of abandoned houses in Detroit is declining. The number of homes that are being renovated now exceeds the number of properties being demolished, which that's been true for about 2 years now. That hadn't been true probably since, I would guess, maybe the early 1920s. So, you know, in terms of within neighborhoods that are experiencing declining conditions. So that's my two takes on it. One is that I try to focus on what can we do in response, and two is that some of the things that feel like permanent conditions, like another event that we had once was with Jose Camilo Vergara, who wrote, you know, he's done fantastic work documenting change in cities. He, in the early 90s, said that Detroit should turn its downtown into a skyscraper acropolis. You know, what could you possibly do with all of these abandoned skyscrapers? There were more than, I think, 15 abandoned skyscrapers downtown in the early 2000s. They're almost all occupied now. You know, who would have expected it? Again, I don't think that the fundamental conditions of poverty and segregation, et cetera, have been solved, but we'd also be a little bit myopic to ignore the fact that conditions do change, and occasionally for the better.
I will also, I think, build on what Meagan said and reflect that I think Gransky said that you're a pessimist by experience, but an optimist by will. And I think it's really hard to not read the academic literature and not feel, I think, to George Gulster's quote, like depressed about how you think this may continue and convey that to the classes of cities that you have. But I think in thinking of all the students that we have and the people that are going out, and even the educators that have influenced us to come back from afar to present on this panel and participate in this symposium, speaks to the fact that like you have created a legacy of students that are carrying on this work, and we will hopefully be able to do that with our students going forward. And so I convey that with a sort of like paired mentality of thinking about community and creating spaces of understanding and listening that fostered like legitimate joy and love as opposed to hate and dissent and misunderstanding that I think can truthfully begin to heal some of the wrong. I don't expect to dismantle systemic racism in my lifetime. I think it's going to be a generational fight, and I by no means think that I will be the one to do it. But I think that I can create a positive environment for people to believe that it's possible by understanding how it functions, by understanding what builds it from a capitalist perspective, from a racial perspective, and then use those tools to begin to dismantle it slowly in future generations. And maybe that's too optimistic, but I think that without any type of belief in that future, there's no bright spot of where we're going to be going. So I hope that's a great question. I hope it helps.
It's a great question. May and Christine, do you have any thoughts about this? Especially since, I think one of the interesting things about the egalitarian metropolis is that because of the moment in which we were in, it has much more of a anti-racist, activist kind of feel to it than maybe some of the earlier Detroit school stuff might have had. So thoughts on this question?
So I'm going to go with my thoughts and, great. You hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with my thoughts and then hopefully that will evolve into a question for all of you too. But I think one thing that I've really been pushed to do by a lot of my committee members who are here and also in the Carlsruhe State Project is we see these systems of predatory loaning and land theft and uneven development in place. Yet oftentimes Detroit gets told through this monolithic perspective where you only see that negative story. And I've really tried to incorporate looking at what activists are doing and have done in the past, even writing as far back as thinking about the Republic of New Africa or the origins of community land trusts in Detroit, to see these alternative paths over that don't really get as much news because there's so much emphasis on the tragic in a way. And I think in my own dissertation research, Robert, you've been really big on emphasizing how when I'm looking at neighborhoods and thinking about how people have come up with solutions, even very local solutions to through interfaith efforts, through working across racial lines, creating and designing neighborhoods as simple as say designing a neighborhood playground that everyone can use. So I think the question I have, I'm going to latch onto your question, Myles, for the alum or the senior people is how do you incorporate these multiple narratives into your research and your work so that you don't fall into the trap of kind of having a singular monolithic narrative?
So while they're thinking of that, May, did you have anything to add on these questions about, how do you lean into things that seem tragic, the kind of anti-racist evolution of these projects?
Well, I have to say that my own research interest does not concern that much about urban humanities. So a lot of things I learned in the symposium was quite new to me, but I definitely have to say that this experience is transformative in some way, because it does help me to find the purpose of doing research in this region. At some point, I was complaining about doing the urban planning degree in University of Michigan has some disadvantage of not being close to a real big city. Like you can like imagine the kind of big city I was thinking is New York, Boston, and Los Angeles, those really big cities which may be more proactive and progressive in taking on new technologies, which I am really interested in. But Detroit is actually quite in the struggle of providing surveys, providing equitable access of services for people. But like with this experience, it was really hard to not emphasize with people's experience in the past few decades. And it's really hard to not empathize with the struggles people experience, especially those people from Black communities. And I'm taking on the equity perspective in my personal dissertation research, learning about health equity in the Southeast Michigan region. I find this experience really give me some like inner driven like as purposes for me to actually think about, well, this is not just about using a new data source, and this is not just about using different quantitative aspects to depict the inequity in the region, but it's really something like I want to produce and help people think about equity in this region, and maybe helpful to drive the future social change. But speaking of social change, it's too big, and I don't think it's something like I can like fulfill with my dissertation research. But I was just, if I would ask a question for the more senior PhDs, I would ask, what are your expectations for future generational researchers? And I know actually like cities like Los Angeles or New York, they're actually outliers of cities all around the world. They are extremely big, they're extremely central in the global city network. But the struggles of people in Detroit is actually common for many communities in the United States and even around the world. What knowledge we can produce in the University of Michigan that actually helps improve people's life in cities like Detroit and beyond Detroit.
I think for our more senior and seasoned scholars, I love that you all are now described as senior. I just like, oh my God, how's that even possible? You all when you were like babies, right? It's great. I think I'm gonna have us move part of that conversation into the reception. And I think I'm also going to invite you all to be in touch with Robert and I, shoot us some thoughts about the questions posed by both Christine and by Meg and by Myles. I think it's going to be helpful as we kind of package the grant and bring things to a close, start to think about making some recommendations about where some of these things that we've been doing at the University of Michigan might go next, especially drawing on the collaborative infrastructure across schools, across units. So you'll be, I think, happy to know that Taubman and two departments in LSA, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and Digital Studies, have once again, there's a cluster hire that's going to be involved, I think, in helping to ground some of our work and to push it forward. It's an anti-racist hiring initiative that the Provost Office has started. And it's precisely around some of these ideas in the digital humanities, the urban humanities, thinking about urban spaces. When I think about that project and some of the other things that have been going on, Myles actually has been involved in a course that's taking seriously propositions about reparations. It's a moment in which the reparations conversation in Detroit is taking off in really interesting ways. I think that might kind of be one direction that one could think about for the future of some of these projects here as we continue to try and be in dialogue and collaboration with partners in Detroit. So some of that in writing would be great. Some of those thoughts, and we'll move, direct answers to their very good questions into our reception. But to give us some final thoughts and some last words, I'm really happy to introduce and welcome Carolyn Lowe. Who's an associate professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at Wayne State. Her research focuses broadly on municipal planning and land use regulatory processes and the actors and politics involved in those processes. She's conducted research on the role and impact of planning consultants on municipal comprehensive planning processes, planning capacity, planning ethics, plan implementation, planning for equity, arts and cultural planning, and local land use regulation around fracking and open space subdivisions. A former planning consultant, she frequently collaborates with planning practitioners and has written about the importance of practice-focused research. She's an alum of Michigan, of both LSA and of Taubman. So she received her BA in English language and literatures, her master's in urban planning, and her PhD in urban planning, all here with us. She's currently partnering with the Michigan Association of Planners to study how local governments are including equity issues in her comprehensive plans. And we're thrilled to have her offer some last words. Carolyn?
Angela and Dan, who was my student at Wayne State, asked me to speak. They were like, so talk about Robert and Margie and June, and also kind of sum up the whole egalitarian project. I'll do my best. I was thinking about what I want my legacy to be as an educator and a scholar, and what the legacies of Margie and June and Robert have been as educators and scholars. And basically, you kind of send people and ideas out into the world, right? And you hope that they take on a life of their own, those ideas grow and see other ideas, those people teach other people. And that's really your legacy, is having those things go out away from you. And I want to talk about these three faculty who have all in different ways been actually instrumental in my own professional and scholarly journey. I'll talk about them in order of when I met them, I think, maybe. And then I also will kind of weave in a little bit about their own scholarly contributions. And then I'll try to talk about the egalitarian metropolis. So we'll see how I do. So first I want to talk about Robert Fishman. Robert reminded me last week that he and I met when I was a senior in college, because I did a pilot, like a 3+2 program with urban, with her English and urban planning, which don't actually talk to each other all that well, but so I think I took a class with him his first year here at Michigan. And then I interacted with him even more when I came back to do my PhD later. He taught our 835 course, where we took our first baby steps toward our dissertation. And what really stood out to me about Robert was his kindness and generosity of spirit toward us, because we were just flailing around. We were like, I might do this thing. And I know there's somebody who was writing about concrete. And there were people who like switched ideas midstream, and he just took us seriously from the very beginning as colleagues. He just treated us as colleagues, and that was so empowering and so reassuring when we really didn't know what we were doing. He never made anything feel like a competition between any of us. It was always a collaboration, always us supporting each other. I've heard other places that it doesn't feel like that, and it never felt otherwise here. So, and he's a huge part of that. Later, when I got the job offer at Wayne State, I talked to Robert because I wasn't sure how I felt about teaching in an evening program. I wasn't sure what that would be like. It wasn't something I considered. And he, who had taught in an evening program at Rutgers Camden, said, yeah, there's some actually really cool things about it. And he really encouraged me to take that job. And I'm so glad I did. That's an immensely rewarding place to be. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute.
But you were really instrumental in me deciding to kind of take that leap, try something that I hadn't really considered. In terms of his intellectual influence on me and on the field, I would say that planners love cities, and we talk about Detroit, but as many of you have said today, it's so important to see Detroit as part of this ecosystem of suburbs, right? It's not just Detroit, it's Southeast Michigan, and you can't just look at Detroit in isolation. And Robert has always taken suburbs seriously as worthy of intellectual effort and scholarly attention. And also, in the context of this project, as vital players in an eventual egalitarian metropolis, you can't just focus on the city and expect the city to feed itself if you don't address what's happening in the periphery. June actually mentioned this last week, and gave me an idea, and I haven't. Someday I'll do something with that, but it reminded me to go back to something I thought about earlier. So I also would say that he, in his work on regionalism, has suggested that this kind of grassroots voluntary regionalism might be a stronger, robust regionalism that actually results in a more egalitarian region. And that's something that's pretty interesting, especially in light of some hopeful little green shoots that we've seen around Southeast Michigan lately, such as the passage of the transit bill in Oakland and Wayne, and yes, in Macomb County. So, so that's something that interesting to consider that his research leads us to. I would also say that over a long career has really remained optimistic about what planners can and should do to improve quality of life and outcomes in the city. It's easy to be depressed or cynical when you see kind of big structural forces at work that don't seem to change, and you see people who have suffered and lost things. And I think it's important to remember what are the things we can be doing. There are always things we can do. So I think Robert has really remained an optimistic work-based that way. Now I'll turn to Margie. And Margie is really the reason I am standing here today, because I came to see her probably in 2004, I think. And I said, Margie, I've been out working for a while, and I really think I'd like to come back and PhD. What PhD program should I consider? And Margie said, well, if you get your application in the next week or so, you could potentially join our incoming class this fall. And we'll give you some money. And I was like, sold. I'll do it. I later realized that they had probably had trouble filling that class, and I had just walked in right at the right moment. So, but it turned out to be a great experience. And so if Margie hadn't recruited me, I don't know where I would have ended up. Sure, it would have worked out fine, but the reason I'm specifically here is really because of Margie. So, never underestimate the power of single conversation to change your life trajectory. Margie has always struck me as somebody with an absolutely uncompromising commitment to intellectual rigor and to engage scholarship. When Meagan was saying that there's no division between kind of the applied work you do and the scholarship, that is absolutely true, and that's how I see you too. And that's really a model for everyone else who does research in urban spaces. There's an absolute moral clarity to Margie's work. You never have to wonder what the right thing is to do. It's always very well argued, and she makes it seem obvious, even though it hasn't always been obvious. And she never settles for either intellectual laziness or general laziness. I remember running into Margie, we live in the same neighborhood, and I ran into her right after she retired, and I was like, "Oh, congratulations on retirement. What are you doing?" And I'm imagining I don't know, some hobby or something. And she's like, "Wow, now I really have time to focus on research." I was like, "Oh, right, I should have realized that was where you were going to go."
So in terms of her intellectual influence on the field and also specifically on me, she has built this body of research over time that really changes the way we think of cities to a lost population along with June. And she works with people who live in the places that she's studying. Not at them, but with them. And that is just, again, so important. She has done an amazing job calling out predatory or inefficient practices that result in further abandonment, and such as tax foreclosure, and really, as Meagan pointed out, has changed the conversation around those, has changed the practices around those in a way that's absolutely obviously impactful. You know, we should all hope to have our research be. And all through Margie's work, you can see her asking the question, how does this knowledge help people, especially people who have been systematically excluded or kept down, ignored? You know, all of her research has a goal of being useful, especially to people who need it. And then, of course, a high point of this work was the book, The City After Abandonment with June. And that's a work that I use in my own classes, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. So that's been influential to me as a teacher, and also as someone who thinks about practical solutions to urban problems. Last, I'll talk about June. June came to Michigan, I think, just maybe a couple of years before I left Michigan. So I didn't get a chance to work directly with you. But I always had your voice in the back of my head because when I was taking the job at Wayne State, Kate Warner gave me a copy of Redevelopment and Race, and it didn't return. And I kind of knew I was never going to return, but I got it because both I wanted to remember Kate and because it was important. And when I read that book, I was so, I mean, it's a dramatic book. It's a very readable, interesting book. And you see this optimism in the planners, but also these tragic mistakes in there. And so, they have this flawed decision-making, they have failure to consider racial and economic equity, or they're deliberately embracing inequitable goals on purpose. And it's just always in my head, trying to be transformative, trying to kind of move fast and break things. That was the post-war planning ethos. And look where it got us. It was not a good idea. And I think there's this sense in which we are being more humble, being more incremental, trying something here, like, okay, let's try this little thing. Is that working? Is that helping people? How do people like it? All right, that seems like it's going okay. So let's maybe expand it. And I think working with people, drawing on that deep expertise of people who live in these areas, people you're talking about the north end, maybe technically gentrification's not happening, but something's happening. They feel it, right? Figuring that out is so important. And I think about my students, most of whom, my grad students, I think most of whom are Detroiters. They're either people who grew up in Detroit, or they moved there because they want to live in Detroit during grad school and then on. I have 2 City of Detroit planners in my land use class right now. All of our students are working because they're new students, and a lot of them are working full-time jobs in planning, which makes our classes super, super interesting. And I'm just, every week they come to land use class after a full day of work and they tell me what they're working on. And they're all, my students are a little bit cynical. I mean, they're not dumb, right? They know, they see everything that's happening. A lot of them have lived in Detroit for a long time. Sometimes, we have a lot of non-traditional students. So some of them are in their 50s or 60s and they're going back for a degree. They've been around, they see how things have gone, but they also are absolutely thinking about what can I do tomorrow to make this place function a little bit better? What can I do in my neighborhood to make it function a little bit better? What are the immediate problems that I can solve? And what Cooper was talking about, changes over the past 5 years. I worked at Meixin for 14 years and things are absolutely very different. So I wasn't around, there's always this sense of, for people who have lived in Detroit a long time, there's a sense of loss. They remember when things were better, there were more people, their elementary school was open, the rec center was open. It is really hard to get around that grief. But over the time that I've been there, so, I don't have that baggage in a way because I wasn't there for it. I'm not from Michigan, I didn't live through that. But the time that I've been at Wayne State, I see so many more opportunities for our students. They're getting work at the city. Our students, they didn't used to hire our students at the city, and now they do. They are finding super interesting things to do, super interesting ways to contribute, and they are excited. So I feel actually great about the possibilities. Again, in that incremental, pragmatic, what can we do today and tomorrow? The big stuff will be sort of revealed in the fullness of time. We don't exactly know yet, but we can absolutely make a difference. And our students are doing that, and your students are doing that. I don't even know what time it is, I'll probably quit. So I'll just wrap up by saying about the Egalitarian Metropolis project itself, which I wasn't super involved with. I was laughing when Sonia said that she was a little thrown when asked to talk about it, and I was too, because this is something that started after I left Michigan. But I think some of the things that I took away from learning about the Egalitarian Metropolis project were so important to learn from the past, to understand what's happened before, what solutions that people already tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what was valuable that we have lost that we can keep back. And what are the kind of hurts and harms that we need to work on healing, because those are still very much alive. So historians like Angela, and I don't know if you're technically a historian, you're like a planning historian sometimes, but June, make sure we don't forget those things. And Robert, of course, obviously. We need to work for and with people who live in the places that we're studying, whether it's Detroit or somewhere else. Margie has always kept us honest in that way. We need to appropriately view Detroit and its ecosystem of suburbs and rural areas, as Robert Fishman does, in which quality of life is not a zero-sum game. We have to help people in the metro area understand that when Detroit does well, that is good for everyone. It's good for Michigan. We need to help people in like the western and northern parts of the state understand that too. And we always need to keep equity at the forefront. I've been engaging over my career a lot with Scott Campbell's work, who I wasn't charged with talking about today, but has been very influential for me. But that third point of the planner's triangle, that equity, really has often gotten pushed to the back. And that is something that can be different and may be different if we kind of keep working around the edges, keep nudging in that direction. Again, it's not going to fix itself overnight, but it's something that if it didn't even used to be that much part of the conversation, and it is. So I think that's helpful. But projects like this, with their very significant reach, you look at these legions of grad students who are here today. There are so many more who aren't even here. So they're all going out into the world and taking these ideas with them. There's so much energy from this project, all of the events that Cooper and others organize. And they really can help us seek this new direction and create what could be a truly egalitarian metropolis. And I think we have, I think we're headed in the right direction. So thank you so much.
Let me just do 30 seconds of thank yous. Thank you, Carolyn, for that. Really wonderful. Really appreciate it. We've been thinking a lot over the course of these days of the symposium. Dan Comer and Anna Mascarella, who have done so much of the heavy lifting, organizing, 5 sessions in multiple locations in 2 cities. We really appreciate that work. Our thanks to the Mellon Foundation for the support over the years. Dean Massey and the Taubman College and all of our colleagues here who have been helping both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes in so many ways. My colleagues in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, our supporters in the Rackham Graduate School here on campus. We thank all of you for coming back to be here this afternoon. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. We heard from a lot of other people who have been involved in these projects over the years who weren't able to join us, but sent really wonderful notes. So appreciate you all. To Robert, Margie, and June for letting us gush a little bit about all that we've learned from you and with you over the years. To the audience here at Taubman and those of you online, thank you so much for joining us for this session, which is going to conclude, of course, the Egalitarian Metropolis Symposium towards an inclusive recovery for Detroit. And most of all, and finally, every single person who's been involved and made possible all of this work, past, present, and future. Thank you so much. And for those of you here, you can join us at the reception.
Okay.